Have you ever wondered what it feels like to lie down in the darkness of a Viking longhouse, with nothing but straw, wool, and the warmth of animal skins between you and the frozen world outside? The question hangs in the air like a cold breath exhaled into winter. Before the crackle of the fire, before the settling creak of old timber, before your own heartbeat begins to match the quiet rhythm of the night, you sense something else. A presence. A story that has survived 1,000 years. A memory trapped inside smoke-blackened rafters and frost-bitten soil, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. Because Viking beds were never just places to sleep. They were shelters within shelters. Refuges carved out of a brutal world. Fragile walls against snowstorms that could swallow entire villages. Silent witnesses to births, deaths, secrets, and the kind of exhaustion only ancient warriors understood. But before any comfort, before wool brushed against skin or straw softened the weight of bones, there was hardship. A kind of cold that feels alive, creeping through every gap in the wooden walls, testing how long a human spirit can endure before it cracks. And in that cold, the Vikings built something simple, something ingenious, and something far more meaningful than the materials would ever suggest. Picture it not as a museum display or a neat reconstruction polished by historians, but as it truly was: raw, smoky, dim. A longhouse that feels more like a living creature than a structure. The air thick with the scent of burning pine, wet wool drying by the fire, and the faint sweetness of stored grain. Shadows dance on the walls, shifting like spirits, while outside, the wind claws at the wooden planks, desperate to get in. It is here, in this mixture of warmth and threat, that the story of Viking bedding begins. A Viking doesn't simply lie down at night. He or she battles the cold, negotiates with the dark, surrenders slowly to the weight of the day. A bed is not just comfort, it is survival. It is a small victory carved out of straw and skin. Imagine hands rough from rowing and farming, hands that carry scars like stories, gathering bundles of yellow straw freshly dried from the harvest. Listen to the whisper of the stalks as they're laid down, forming the earliest layer of a bed. It is the sound of preparation, the sound of necessity. Each handful is spread carefully, not for softness alone but for insulation, because warmth, in a Viking winter, is the difference between waking and not waking. Now feel the wool. Heavy. Dense. Scratchy in some places, soft in others. This wool has been shorn, cleaned in freezing river water, combed by patient fingers, spun into thick layers that hold heat as though guarding it. Wool isn't just a material, it is the memory of the sheep that survived the stormy hillsides, the devotion of the women who worked tirelessly to transform raw fleece into comfort. Each thread carries the labor of the community. And then the animal skins: bear, deer, reindeer, sheep pulled from the hunts, tanned by fire, smoke, and time. These skins are more than blankets. They are guardians. They trap warmth, they soften the edges of the world, they shield a sleeping body from the harsh bite of winter. The Vikings didn't just sleep in furs, they slept with the spirit of the animal itself, believing its strength lingered in the hide. But this first section isn't simply about materials. It is about the silence before sleep. The fragile moment when darkness settles and the longhouse becomes a world of its own. Children whisper stories they only dare to tell at night. Elders stare into the embers of the fire, remembering battles fought and friends buried. A warrior lies awake, feeling every ache in his body, every memory pressing against the edges of his mind. Outside, wolves circle the village, sometimes near, sometimes far, and their distant howls blend into the lullaby of the cold northern wind. Inside, the beds creak, straw shifts, wool settles. Every sound is alive. Every shadow breathes. And as you hear the gentle rustling of straw beneath a tired body, you begin to understand, Viking beds were not just constructions of straw, wool, and animal skins. They were reflections of Viking life, simple yet powerful, rugged yet intimate, crafted with purpose in a world that offered no kindness for free. So ask yourself again. What does it truly feel like to lie in a Viking bed? Not the bed of a warrior in a saga, nor a king in a hall of legends, but the bed of a real person, surviving real winters, facing real fears. This story will take you there. To the cold, the warmth, the struggle, the brilliance, and the quiet humanity of those who built comfort out of the unforgiving North. Stay with it until the end, and you will discover not just how Vikings made their beds, but why those beds mattered more than history ever mentions. The story of a Viking bed does not begin inside the longhouse. It begins long before winter, long before darkness swallows the sky at midday, out in the open fields where the wind bends the tall grasses and the earth prepares its quiet warning, winter is coming. Every Viking understood this. Every family felt it in their bones. Because in the north, winter wasn't a season, it was a force. Something you planned for as if preparing to face an ancient enemy. And one of the first battles of survival was the harvest of straw. Straw was never just straw. It was the foundation of comfort, a buffer between human flesh and the unforgiving cold seeping up from the hard-packed ground. It held warmth the way a mother holds a child, firm, protective, determined. So imagine the fields at the end of summer. The sky a pale blue dome stretching endlessly over golden waves of barley and rye. Men, women, and children working side by side, sickles flashing like silver crescent moons in the sunlight. The sound of the harvest wasn't peaceful, it was sharp, rhythmic, urgent. Because every stalk gathered meant one more layer of protection against the winter nights that killed without hesitation. They tied the bundles into sheaves, letting them dry beneath the weak but faithful northern sun. Women shook out the stalks, removing dirt and insects, while children gathered the smallest pieces and stacked them neatly. By the time the last sheaf was stored, the family had earned something priceless, the beginning of their winter beds. The straw didn't simply lie on the floor of the longhouse. No, Vikings treated it with care. They shook it out, layered it thick, replaced it often when it grew damp or packed. Because straw had a scent, a warm, earthy, sun-kissed smell that brought comfort in the darkest nights. It absorbed sweat, trapped heat, softened the weight of tired bodies. But it also reminded them, even in midwinter, of the brief months when the world was green and the sky was generous. This was the first layer of a Viking bed. A memory of summer. A fragile promise of warmth pressed beneath the body. But straw alone was never enough. Not against the long nights when frost crept like a living creature through the gaps in the timber walls. Not against the storms that howled like ancient spirits seeking entrance. And so, after the harvest of straw came the labor of wool. Where straw carried the memory of sunlight, wool carried the memory of struggle. Every fleece held stories of sheep that endured rain-lashed cliffs, predators lurking beyond the shadows, and winters where the herd thinned because nature demanded payment for survival. To turn raw fleece into warmth was a task that consumed months. First came washing cold river water biting into hands already worn from work. The wool was soaked, beaten, rinsed, and spread to dry on wooden racks where mist from the sea sometimes touched it. Then came the combing, the carding, the spinning, tasks done mostly by women, though men with skilled hands sometimes joined. They worked by the fire, their movements steady, practiced, almost sacred. The sounds of the longhouse at night were filled with the soft rasp of wool being drawn through combs and the slow hum of spinning wheels. This was the hidden heartbeat of Viking life. The quiet labor that never made it into sagas or songs. The kind of work that held families together more surely than swords or shields. Layer by layer, wool transformed into the thick blankets that guarded Viking beds. It trapped heat with a fierce loyalty. Even damp, it remained warm, an invaluable trait in the north where moisture was an uninvited guest that found its way into everything. And then, the final ingredient. The one that made Viking beds feel alive. Animal skins. Hunting was never just sport, it was survival. A family that secured a deer, a bear, or even a large seal gained more than meat, they gained warmth. The hides were cleaned, scraped, stretched, and smoked. Every step smelled of fire, sweat, and the wild. Some skins were prized so deeply that they were passed down through generations, becoming silent heirlooms. A bear skin was a treasure. A reindeer hide was a blessing. A wolf pelt was a story whispered in the dark. When these skins were finally placed atop the layers of straw and wool, a Viking bed became something remarkable, a small island of warmth in a world carved by cold winds. Imagine lying in such a bed after a day of rowing in icy fjords, or tending livestock in snow that swallowed footprints instantly, or returning from a journey where the cold bit at your bones without mercy. You lower yourself into the softness, and the animal skins embrace you like a guardian spirit. The wool beneath molds gently to your body. The straw shifts with a soft, whispering sigh. Outside, the storm might rage. The longhouse might groan. But inside your bed, your handmade shelter, you feel something like peace. This was the purpose behind every step, every piece of straw collected, every fleece washed, every hide treated with care. To carve warmth out of a world that offered none freely. And as night settled, while the fire dimmed to glowing embers and the shadows of the longhouse thickened, the bed became a connection. To the summer sun. To the animals that sustained them. To the hands that worked tirelessly. To the earth itself. This is how the Vikings built their beds, from straw, wool, and animal skins. Not as a luxury. Not as decoration. But as a declaration of survival. Night inside a Viking longhouse was not simply darkness, it was a world within a world, a living space that breathed, shifted, whispered, and remembered. To understand the bed, to truly feel its purpose, you must first understand what surrounded it when the sun disappeared behind the jagged northern horizon. Because when the doorbar slid into place, when the last ember of sunlight vanished and the wind outside became nothing more than a distant scream against wood, the longhouse transformed. It no longer felt like a structure of timber and earth. It felt like a ship adrift on a black ocean, its only defense against the storm, warmth, family, fire, and the fragile sanctuary of sleep. Inside, the air thickened with mingled scents. Dried fish stored overhead. Smoke climbing lazily toward soot-blackened rafters. Damp wool drying near the fire. The earthy musk of straw and old wood. And beneath it all, the subtle animal warmth of bodies resting close together. Viking beds were built along the walls, raised slightly from the floor, lining the longhouse like the ribs inside a great wooden beast. Each bed space belonged to someone: families, warriors, elders, even visiting travelers sheltered for a night or two. There was order in this arrangement, a quiet hierarchy understood by everyone. The family who owned the house slept closest to the central fire. Children beside them. Elders in the warmest corners. Men who traveled often or worked at sea took the outer spaces, always ready to rise at the slightest sound. And beyond them, near the door, slept the watchful ones, those responsible for listening to the night. Because night was never silent. The walls creaked in the wind's icy grip. Snow shifted on the roof like the slow crawl of some unseen creature. Outside, wolves padded through the drifts, their paws whispering against the frozen earth. Sometimes one would stop near the longhouse, sensing heat and life within, and its low growl would vibrate through the wood like a warning from nature itself. Inside, the beds responded to every sound. Straw rustled as someone turned in their sleep. Wool muffled the trembling of a dream. Animal skins shifted like a soft breath across the room. The longhouse at night was a portrait of contrasts. The fire flickered warm, yet cold lurked only inches beyond the walls. Families huddled close, yet danger pressed from outside, testing the strength of their shelter. Sleep came, but always lightly, always with one ear open, as if the north itself demanded respect even in rest. Children whispered stories beneath their blankets, their voices barely carried by the heavy air. They spoke of spirits that roamed the mountains, of goddesses who walked the snowstorms, of ancestors watching from the darkness behind the flames. Stories were comfort, but they were also warnings, reminders of how thin the line was between warmth and cold, safety and danger. An elder might cough, a low rattling sound softened by the wool wrapped around him. A warrior might shift, adjusting his sword within reach. A mother might keep a hand on her child's chest, feeling the soft rise and fall that meant the world to her. The longhouse listened to them all. It held their breaths, their fears, their hopes, their warmth. In this atmosphere, Viking beds became more than sleeping platforms. They were miniature fortresses, crafted with intention. Each layer straw, wool, hide held back the night inch by inch. The straw kept the cold from rising. The wool trapped heat like a loyal guardian. The animal skin sealed everything together, forming a cocoon against the Nordic dark. But there was one more element that made the beds truly sacred. The closeness. Vikings did not sleep alone unless they had to. Families shared warmth. Children curled into their mothers. Brothers slept back to back after a day of work or travel. Old friends, returning from long voyages, shared the same bed space without hesitation because in the north, warmth was survival, not luxury. Imagine lying there. The fur against your cheek still faintly smelling of smoke and forest. The wool beneath you warming slowly as your body relaxes. The straw shifting gently as your muscles release the day's tension. Your breath forming small clouds in the air before the heat of the bed absorbs them. The firelight painting moving shapes across the rafters above you. Even sleep felt different here. It wasn't soft or distant or careless. It was a fragile agreement between body and world. Rest, but stay ready. Sleep, but know the cold is waiting. Dream, but only lightly. The bed was a promise, one that held through countless winters, storms, and nights filled with uncertainty. Yet the warmth it provided was not merely physical. It was emotional. Spiritual. It was the warmth of belonging, of knowing that you were protected not only by hides and wool, but by the people beside you. And perhaps this is the deepest truth about Viking beds. They were crafted for individuals. But they were built for families. The longhouse slept as one. One breath. One warmth. One heartbeat pushing back against the endless cold of the northern world. In this sacred darkness, wrapped in wool and fur, surrounded by the familiar rustling of straw and the steady breathing of kin, the Viking bed became more than a place to rest. It became a reminder that even in the harshest lands, humans found ways to create gentleness. Even here. In a world that demanded strength. They learned to build comfort with their own hands. For all the storm-worn legends of axe-bearing warriors and fearless seafarers, the Vikings had another kind of hero, one rarely praised in sagas, rarely carved into wood, rarely sung about beneath the halls of kings. Yet without these silent craftsmen, no longhouse could weather winter, no family could rest, and no warrior could wake with the strength needed to face the brutal world outside. These were the hands behind the beds. The quiet weavers. The patient tanners. The straw binders. The ones who crafted warmth itself. The world often imagines Vikings as fierce, restless conquerors, but real warmth came from patience, not rage. It came from individuals whose names were lost to the centuries, but whose work shaped every night, every dream, every breath taken in the sheltering dark of a longhouse. Their labor began long before the first frost touched the ground. Women gathered wool in summer, but it was autumn when the air sharpened and daylight thinned that the true work began. Their fingers danced across combs, disentangling clumps of fleece. The rhythm of their hands echoed through the longhouse, a soft, steady cadence that soothed even the most restless children. Wool clung to their sleeves, their hair, their breaths until the women themselves seemed wrapped in something warm and sacred. The spinners worked close to the hearth, creating thick yarn that radiated the scent of smoke and peat. They pressed the strands together, layer by layer, shaping blankets heavy enough to defeat the cold. Each blanket took weeks. Some took months. Some were passed down across generations, becoming softer with every winter, warmer with every family that curled beneath them. Nearby, the tanners worked outside the longhouse, where the earth felt harder and the air carried the sharp tang of treated hides. Their world was filled with scraping tools, stretched skins, and smoke curling upward like prayers. It was difficult work, labor that stained the hands, stung the eyes, and demanded strength from the arms and patience from the spirit. Yet without them, no bed would hold its warmth. No night would feel safe. Hides were not merely dried and thrown atop straw. They were shaped with intention. Smoothed until they no longer crackled. Softened until they bent like ripened bark. Smoked until they resisted rot and moisture. Some hides bore faint patterns, markings left by the animal's life. A scar from a predator. A dark stripe of muscle. A mark from a branch scraped during a storm. To the Vikings, these imperfections were not flaws. They were stories. Memories preserved in leather. Straw, too, had its caretakers. Children often helped, laughing as they shook dust from the stalks or gathered bundles heavier than they were. But adults guided the process, tying, stacking, storing, sorting. The cleanest stalks were chosen for bedding. Long, golden, and dry as sun-baked fields. They kept them hanging in lofts or stored in woven baskets, protected from moisture as jealously as they protected grain. And so it happened that each bed, each simple Viking bed, was not the work of one person, but of many. A blanket carried the warmth of a mother's hands. A hide carried the memories of a hunter's journey. The straw carried the labor of a village, harvested under a sun that felt impossibly distant by winter. Night after night, winter after winter, these materials formed the border between life and death. What makes this even more remarkable is that none of these craftsmen worked for praise. They didn't expect it. They didn't desire it. Their work was too essential to be glorified, it was simply done. Picture an elderly woman whose fingers are bent from years of spinning wool. She sits by the fire, twisting strands with practiced grace, the glow warming the wrinkles etched by decades of seasons. She speaks softly, telling a younger girl how to judge the thickness of the yarn, how to test the strength, how to feel the warmth that isn't there yet but will be, Once the blanket is finished, picture a man scraping a deer hide under the pale light of day, his breath fogging in the cold. His hands move with precision. He knows where the hide will crack if scraped too thin, where it must remain thick to keep someone warm. He works in silence, knowing the winter will not be kind, but trusting in his craft to protect the ones he loves. Picture a boy gathering straw from a pile twice his height, stumbling under its weight. A father steadies him. A sister laughs and ties the bundle. Together, they shape something that will help them survive the months ahead. This was the true nature of Viking craftsmanship. A collective effort. A woven tapestry of lives, skills, seasons, and stories. When night fell, and the longhouse drifted into its warm, collective breathing, every person lying upon those beds was resting on the labor of their community. The warmth they felt wasn't only the warmth of wool or skin, it was the warmth of hands, of hearts, of shared purpose. And in a land where storms could erase entire settlements, that warmth mattered more than any sword ever forged. This is the chapter history often forgets. The unseen artisans who built comfort in a harsh world. Who shaped softness from fierce landscapes. Who whispered warmth into the bones of winter. Their legacy is not carved in stone, but felt in the quiet darkness. Every time a Viking pulled a blanket to their chest, and allowed sleep to pull them gently into its arms. Before you can understand why Viking beds mattered so deeply, you must understand the enemy they were built to defy. Not steel. Not rival clans. Not even the sea with all its unpredictable fury. The greatest enemy of the Viking world was the cold. A cold so vast, so unforgiving, that it became a character in every life. A presence that shaped choices, carved fears, and demanded respect. To a Viking, winter was not simply a season, it was a force with intention. It came quietly. First in the shortening of days, when the sun dipped lower on the horizon and shadows stretched longer across the fields. Then in the biting wind that stiffened fingertips and turned breath into pale clouds. Then in the frost that crept across rooftops like silver fingers tracing the edges of a sleeping village. And then came the real cold. The one that didn't leave. The cold that slipped beneath clothing. That crawled into bones. That numbed lips and slowed fingers. The cold that turned the simplest tasks into battles, milking the goats, chopping wood, fetching water from a river that reluctantly surrendered through cracks of ice. Inside the longhouse, warmth was precious, but it never felt guaranteed. Even with the fire burning, the cold seeped around ankles like a ghost rising from the ground. It pressed through gaps in the walls. It condensed in the corners, forming beads of ice that glittered like frozen stars. People learned to read the cold. Its moods. Its warnings. Its promises of harder days ahead. Children were taught early that wandering outside at night could mean not returning. Animals huddled close, breath frosting the air as they slept behind low partitions. Families rationed food, knowing the sea could freeze and hunting could fail. Every Viking understood that the struggle wasn't to stay warm once, but to stay warm again and again, night after night, month after month, until spring dared to return. And this is why the bed was not a luxury. It was a weapon. A shield. A quiet defiance against the north wind that swept across the land with icy claws. The straw at the bottom insulated bodies from the ground's deep, merciless chill. Without it, no wool blanket and no hide could prevent frost from biting upward through the floorboards. The wool held heat with a devotion unmatched by any other material the Vikings possessed. Wool did not simply warm, it fought against the cold even when damp, refusing to surrender its protective nature. The fur, the final layer, offered the most primal comfort of all. There was something ancient, something instinctive, about sleeping beneath the skin of an animal that had once survived the same world. A wolf hide could feel like sleeping beneath the spirit of a hunter. A bearskin felt like lying in the shadow of a powerful guardian. But even with straw, wool, and hides, the cold still came. It crept into the longhouse in the dead of night, when the fire burned low and every breath turned white. You could feel it on your nose first, that sharp sting of winter's whisper. Then it edged toward your fingers, your toes, your exposed cheek. And you would draw the blanket closer. Tuck the fur around your shoulder. Pull yourself deeper into the cocoon you built with your own hands. This was the nightly ritual of survival. And while the Vikings were fearless in battle, the cold humbled even the bravest among them. It didn't matter if a man had sailed across distant seas or fought giants in sagas told by firelight. In winter, he was simply a human breathing beneath wool and skin, praying the warmth held. There were nights when the cold grew so bold that the fire crackled differently, faster, sharper, like it was afraid. Nights when the wind screamed as if carrying the voices of ancient spirits across the snow-covered plains. Nights when even the animals in the house grew restless, their instincts sensing something humans could not. On those nights, beds became sanctuaries. A single ember glowing in the hearth. The heavy weight of wool hugging weary limbs. The earthy scent of straw rising as someone shifted. The thick fur wrapping like a protective beast around the body. Humans survived those nights not because they were strong, but because they prepared. Because the beds they built were more than materials. They were layered memories of summer, autumn, and the hunt. They were the work of many hands. The planning of many months. The hope of many hearts. And in the cold, hope is sometimes the warmest layer of all. This is how a Viking bed became a fortress. A quiet stand against an enemy that never slept, never weakened, never showed mercy. Yet the cold did something else too. Something unexpected. It strengthened the bond between people who shared warmth. It reminded families how deeply they needed one another. It taught the Vikings that comfort is not found in perfect softness, but in shared survival. And every night, as the longhouse breathed steadily and the cold pressed at the walls like a beast pacing outside, the Vikings held onto their warmth with both hands. Because in the north, warmth was not a privilege. It was life itself.